In this episode, Tom and Tim take a look at healthcare compliance in the EU. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back with Tim Batteroff for another episode of Compliance Man. Of course, Tim and Compliance Man. It's odd. We never see them together. I'm beginning to wonder if they might be the same person.
That's a good question, Tom.
That's a good question. Yes, he's on a EuroTrip. We'll have to explore that. And today we're thrilled to be joined by our colleague, Andrea Cardoso. Andrea, first of all, welcome to Compliance Man.
Thank you.
In the EuroTrip, we focus on hot topics from the European compliance perspective. Tim has worked in emerging markets. I've worked in the United States, but we wanted to really focus on Europe, the EU, for this series. So we're inviting European experts to discuss topics so our listeners can understand the European context. And with that, could you tell our audience your professional background?
Sure. Thanks a lot for inviting me for this conversation about healthcare compliance in Europe. I am Andrea Cardoso, and I have been acting as a compliance. I have worked in different roles, local, regional roles, but also overseeing international markets.
Andrea, we have to share with our audience your Texas connection, because I live in Texas. So could you tell us your connection to the great state of Texas?
Yes, of course. I had the great pleasure to work for Dell Technologies, based in Austin, as a compliance officer in my time in Latin America, and it was a great experience.
So Tim, over to you.
Unfortunately, not that many connections with the great state of Texas, except that I have a great friend, which is Thomas Fox.
Absolutely.
Good. Andrea, as you are in the healthcare industry, maybe let's start to saying that you are a member, as we know, of the Ethics and Compliance Committee of MedTech Europe. Can you please share with us what are the best practices in the industry?
Sure, yes. The healthcare space is highly regulated. And when we talk about best practices in the healthcare compliance space, we are focusing very much on the interactions with healthcare professionals. It's very important to mention that the industry interacts with healthcare professionals in several different ways. Sometimes we interact with physicians as customers, other times as when we are supporting medical education or collaborating closely on the development of new products, new therapies, when we are sponsoring a research project, so in overall services engagement as well. So there are a set of principles and best practices that the life science companies follow on those interactions. And it's very important to keep the transparency in all those interactions. So making sure that you do the right thing, but also that you project that perception when engaging in a HCP on services. Keeping equivalence among services provided and remuneration. We will speak about fair market value, which is linked to that. And also that the decision on engaging a HCP for services is based on this professional skill and capability to provide a service and not on their capability to influence the purchase of products or even to recommend products. So when the industry is sponsoring medical education and organizing company events, the meta criteria for events must be observed in what concerns to hospitality, but in overall arrangements related to the events. It's very important to review the event agenda to see if there is a full agenda, if the topics are related to the special. It's very important to keep in mind that we cannot support HCP traveling, what is going to be paid for those attending the event, the accommodation in terms of business class, hotels, meals, making sure that there are no entertainments included in the agenda, and overall the decisions around the whole process.
Andrea, I was intrigued by that list that you went through because it's very similar to issues we face in the United States. But even more interesting is the list you gave us. Those were issues in the 1990s. And indeed, the first time there was ever a court case around, not regulation, but a court case around boards of directors and their responsibility for compliance. It was exactly what you just detailed, even in a medical device company. It's 2023, and the issues you talked about, we are still facing today. I don't frankly understand why we can't seem to get this, what seems to me to be a pretty basic message that, as you said, services and products should be based on professionalism, not gifts, payment for speeches, lavish vacations, trips for your spouse or your partner. And so it really leads me to ask, it seems to me we have to continually educate literally everyone in the healthcare space. We have to educate physicians. We have to educate salespeople. We have to educate pharmaceutical, medical device, healthcare providers, service providers. Is education and communication a big part of what you try to do in your job on a day-to-day basis?
Exactly. It's really a big part of my job. And indeed, I agree with you. It's now over 20 years we are talking about that, but we also must keep in mind that the US is always ahead of other markets. So many times this kind of discussions and decisions on certain legal requirements or even are coming from the US, and then the other markets are kind of adhering to that or and adjusting to that. Here in Europe, it's not so long ago we have started with those practices, but still it's an ongoing work. We do have to educate, as you mentioned, there are so many players in the industry, and we do have to keep everyone on the same page all the time, providing information, and not only providing them information, but preparing them to be able to make a decision on the right way to go, in a way that on a daily basis, you as a compliance officer can see yourself as a redundant resource.
Tim, you were going to introduce an economic concept to Compliance Man. We rarely talk economics here, but what intrigues you about fair market value?
Oh, that's a very good question, Tom, because fair market value is the concept that is very important for specifically healthcare industry. And referring to what Andrea has said and what you have mentioned, Tom, that some classical problems are still there since 1990s. We're trying to educate people. I have faced the situation when we have even the situation when people who are working in the industry, in the company, they were not aware about the requirements. And they were not aware about fair market value, which means that if you're engaging healthcare professional to speak and it's scientific conference and you are supporting scientific things, that it shouldn't be like influence. They said, what for? What for? Otherwise, we're trying to get this guy on board. So it could be very funny situation, and we will count them. We can say it's funny, but it's not really funny. I have seen the countries where when I was at the visit, I was visiting the doctor, and the medical doctor gave me the list of 10 drugs, medications. And I just looked and I was looking, all right, I see how compliance is working there and there. Because then he said, okay, if you cannot afford that, I can delete these 3. And then looking at me, more? And then so I understand that it was just attempt of the pharmaceutical companies to influence that doctor. So he can easily prescribe you something. And I'm sure that it in some countries somehow, but we are fighting, right, Andrea? That it would not, yeah.
So it's a little hard to see me, but I'm a tad overweight. And I had to go to the doctor this week. And for the first time ever, he said, we need to do something about your weight. And I thought, fair enough, not an unfair comment. And then he went on to prescribe a new medicine for me. And I thought, this is very odd. I thought you dealt with weight with diet and exercise and eating, maybe cutting down on the size of your portions or things like that. And I wonder why he is prescribing this medicine now, but I didn't ask him why. But anyway, I had the same feeling. Andrea, I guess maybe ask you, are there other countries, or is the healthcare compliance space in the EU very much a country by country analysis? Can we make any general statements for the American compliance practitioner to follow, or how would you counsel one of your colleagues in the United States to think about the EU market? Because On the one hand, we recognize, even Americans recognize it's multiple countries. On the other hand, we think of the EU now as one institution, one trading partner, one block. How should we think about that from the healthcare compliance perspective?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think by one side we are very much aligned with the industry practices in the US. MedTech Europe is very well aligned with AdvaMed, and also if we look to Asia Pacific, APAC Med is also very well aligned. So those three codes of conduct are aligned, and the practices are, let's say, the same. But here in Europe, you do have some countries with certain legal requirements that differ a little bit on the general industry best practices. So we do have countries like France, like Belgium, even the Netherlands, where the approach to HCPs requires certain procedure, requires certain steps even prior to reach out to them. There are specific needs. For example, in Belgium, if you are offering hospitality for events lasting more than one day, or one day that requires an overnight, then you need to apply for an MD-on visa. And this is authorization request to address to the Belgium MD-on, so they can see what you are offering, what are the limits, the amounts of what you are offering, and if it matches to the limits established by law, and then they will approve and provide you with a visa number. And then with that, in France, you also have a different process, but it's also towards that direction. You have to keep within the set limits. You have to communicate to the authorities. You have to request authorization if you go above meal limits or the overall hospitality limits. There are specific rules and specific limitations in Europe. My advice to compliance officers supporting businesses that are engaging HCPs in Europe is to be aware of those rules per country, to get more information as possible, about what is required in the country where that HCP is practicing their profession, and then plan the approach according to what is legally required in that country.
Tim, back over to you.
Yeah, I fully agree with Andrea. The good story, the beauty of Europe is that, for example, we have some codes. For example, we have EFPI code that might be used as a model constitution for the company that operates in Europe. So for compliance practitioner, as Andrea has said, at least it will be the first reference. Having said that, I'm just also fully agree with Andrea that in certain countries, in particular countries, the rules might be different. Or so might be even a more anecdotic situation. For instance, when the headquarters of the European company is a member to these codes or says, okay, I will comply with these requirements, while its subsidiary 300 kilometers from the headquarters, being in another country, is not a participant. So to the local chapter of the organization that has this code, and then and in the case where you have another legislation, it's a kind of conflict of laws basically. Or in plain words, we are calling to the subsidiary saying, guys, what are you doing? They say we're doing everything per local legislation, and we're saying, have you seen this constitution? They said, not applicable in our country. So could be a lot of nuances, and I fully agree with Andrea. It's a very highly regulated industry, and in Europe there are a lot of countries, there are a lot of rules, so it's better to get acquainted with each particular country and invest time in finding out the details, what is okay and what is not okay in particular country.
Andrea, I'd like to turn to your work in a multinational organization. As I said a little bit earlier, I've always practiced in America, so I've looked at things from an American perspective. But I wanted to ask you about how you interacted with your compliance colleagues when you worked for an American company, when you were headquartered outside the United States. What's it like? Is it very collaborative? Are you able to connect with your colleagues both pre-pandemic and the old way we used to do it on a phone call, and now on Zoom? Is working in a multinational organization in the compliance function a collaborative effort, or are you one woman on an island?
No, definitely I'm not. I can consider myself, yeah, lucky maybe, but I am having a very collaborative work with my colleagues. In the pre-pandemic, we were all in the same office for most of the time. We were sharing discussions, sharing opinion and etc. But indeed, working on an international company, even in the pre-pandemic, we were very used to get into calls, into e-meetings, and many decisions, many discussions were on that way. And with the pandemic, we had 2 years, everyone sitting at home and connected on video calls and etc. So in the post-pandemic, we just continued doing that and then started going back to the office again, but in a hybrid way. So I think it was a gradual movement, which in my opinion, and as per my experience, has been very positive. So continuing the strong collaboration with my colleagues, but also the strong collaboration with the business, with that are for our function in the healthcare industry, like professional education, marketing, sales. Keeping the strong connection is very important. And I can tell you that I have been lucky to keep the collaborative approach.
So I'd like to end with maybe each of us giving three tips or three top challenges. Tim, I'm going to start with you. And what do you see as maybe your three top challenges that you've observed in the EU and healthcare? And then I'll go next and we'll end with our guest, Andrea. So, Tim?
Good. The first would be the something that maybe you have faced. The situation is the following. It's a very niche industry, and people from big pharma, when they start to work, when they terminate their contract at one big pharma company, goes to another, meaning there is an exchange of experiences, and there is also leakage of experiences and practices. And the thing that once I have faced the situation of the melting pot, when you have guys that came from different corporations which had different approaches to compliance, and they are sure that their religion is the right religion, their compliance approach is the right compliance approach. And when they're talking to you, they're saying, what are you doing? Back to my previous work, we did it differently. And then when you have these three people from three different corporations, and they're sure that they're doing everything right because they used to work for the biggest international pharmaceutical companies, it's difficult to explain why we're doing things here like that, and why we're not doing something differently. So that's one of the challenges when you have a lot of smart people, but with different backgrounds and different, so to say, compliance schools or approaches. The second thing would be fair market value, which means that you should not pay too much to the medical professor, for instance, when he's having a speech at the conference, or it might be a practitioner who also is doing scientific work. The thing is that in different countries we have different. You cannot categorize people with different educational backgrounds, because in countries there are different approaches to the medical profession as such, to the scientific degrees, to how much is okay. And that is why I have faced challenges in trying to make unified approach when talking about different countries, because even what was interesting for me, in different countries the salary of the very same specialist of the similar occupation, for example dentist, might be absolutely different. So it's a challenge. We were tried to use the American approaches, and in Europe it might be a lot of nuances. So the second thing is fair market value when we're talking to interactions with healthcare professionals, and when we're trying to scale it on many markets, not one. And probably the last one would be different approaches to what is good and what is not good from the ethical perspective. So everybody is an expert in moral and ethical things. And when there is no regulatory background, or when there is no uniform approach, what is good and what is not good, sometimes you are facing the situation when people are giving you arguments based on their judgments, what is moral and what is not moral, what is ethical and what is not ethical. It's really good. It's probably you cannot avoid that, but it doesn't work in my case as a system, because they're saying we're doing this and this is good. Probably because, for example, they're saying they're not getting a lot of money, those doctors, and we are helping, we're paying to them, but it might not be in the situation when it complies with FCPA, so to say. Or you might get another moral or ethical argument. Other companies are paying more to these doctors. They don't care about this FMV, and they're still fine. And he earns not that much. We should support doctors because they're getting so low salaries. And when you are getting in this type of discussions, it is sometimes might be a challenge. So those three challenges from my list.
So I'm going to take it from the U.S. perspective, and I'm going to start off by hopefully saying something that every compliance officer knows is a best practice as a compliance officer, and that's listen. Just listen. Listen to your fellow compliance officers who are in other countries, but listen to your employees and listen to the concerns they raise, because they may be different than the concerns you hear in the United States or even in the great state of Texas. So listen, be a proactive resource. There's nothing worse than compliance being seen as the land of no, populated by Dr. No, if I can use that Cold War reference. Don't be Dr. No. But equally importantly, and you guys have both touched on this, sometimes the risks are different in different markets. It can be culture, it can be a legal or regulatory difference, or it can be, as Tim said, 300 meters difference. And you could be subject to a different set of standards. Just because you have a risk-based approach in the United States and you have a formula for evaluating your risk, don't assume that formula will work in other markets, and be flexible. And that leads back to number one, which is talk to your colleagues and compadres outside the United States about what they see are their top risks. And then perhaps you may even need to adjust your risk profile on some more geographic or cultural basis. So use a risk-based approach, but take your inputs from the area, place, or that you're doing business and the legal regulations you're under. Andrea, as the guest, we've saved you for last, no doubt the best. What are your three top tips for compliance officers in the healthcare industry?
Yeah, so I would say stay tuned. Keep yourself aware of what is going on, update yourself, make sure you have a seat at Ethics and Compliance Committee in your trade association. It's very important to be there. Also benchmarking, attending peers meetings, like we recently have had the Ethics and Compliance Observatory group meeting here in Amsterdam. These are opportunities where you can learn a lot from each other, but also keep the function well supported. Keeping yourself updated, very important. And internally, I would say, make sure you were close to the business. If you were able to get a seat at the leadership team, it's very good, very important. Keep everyone well informed and well trained. As I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, keep them well trained so they are comfortable to take decisions. They feel they know everything they need to take a decision, and then you feel like you are becoming redundant from that perspective. So these are my tips for the colleagues.
Andrea, I'm going to speak on behalf of Tim to say it was a pleasure to have you on our podcast. I hope our listeners really enjoyed listening to you as much as we enjoyed visiting with you. Tim and I would like to remind our listeners, if you would like to be on our podcast or you take different views of some of our topics, we'd love to visit with you on these, and we'd like to have a sincere global conversation. So, Tim, you want to say a final goodbye from Compliance Man?
Final goodbye from Compliance Man.
Excellent.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this podcast. It was a pleasure being with you.
This is Tom Fox again. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Compliance Man Takes a EuroTrip. If there are compliance issues from the EU perspective you would like to explore, please contact Tim or myself. We'd love to hear from you. Compliance Man Takes a EuroTrip is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.